Hey, look at that thing in the booth. I think his face is melting off. Hey, old man, you're ruining my appetite just by existing. The words cut through the low hum of the roadside diner like a serrated knife, sharp and jagged. The man they were shouting at didn't flinch, didn't look up, and didn't speak. He just stared at his black coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them around the ceramic mug, seeking warmth. 76-year-old Larry was used to the stares, the whispers, and the cruel jokes. His face and arms were a map of twisted, silvery scar tissue, the legacy of a fire that had consumed a lifetime ago. But the loud, leather-clad biker standing over him didn't see a survivor. He saw a monster. He didn't know that the man he was mocking had once swum through burning oil and jagged coral reefs while bullets churned the water into a frothy grave. He didn't know he was poking a sleeping dragon. Before this tense encounter reaches its shocking conclusion, type respect in the comments if you believe that true heroes often walk among us in silence and that we should never judge a book by its cover. Larry moved through the world like a ghost. At 76, he had outlived his wife, his brothers-in-arms, and, seemingly, the manners of the modern world. He lived in a small clapboard house 3 miles down the road from the Rusty Spoon, a diner that smelled of bacon grease and stale cigarette smoke. It was his sanctuary. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Larry would put on his cleanest flannel shirt, buttoning it all the way to the collar to hide the worst of the scarring on his neck, and walk to the diner for a slice of cherry pie. To the locals, he was just the burn victim, a tragic figure to be pitied or avoided. They didn't ask about his past, and he didn't offer it. The scars on his face were thick and ropey, pulling his left eyelid down in a permanent, sorrowful droop. The skin on his arms was parchment thin and discolored. Most people assumed he had fallen asleep with a cigarette or been trapped in a house fire. The truth was far more violent, buried in the classified archives of the United States Navy under the heading Underwater Demolition Team, 1945. Larry was one of the original frogmen, the forefathers of the Navy SEALs. He had dismantled mines with his bare hands, while Japanese shore batteries tried to turn him into pink mist. But today, his enemy wasn't the Imperial Navy. It was a gang of 6 bikers known as the Iron Vipers, and they were bored, hungry, and looking for a target. The bell above the diner door had jingled aggressively 20 minutes earlier, announcing the arrival of the Vipers. They took up the 3 center booths, loud and sprawling, demanding service before they had even sat down. The leader, a massive man named Bear, wore a cut-off denim vest over a black t-shirt, his arms covered in tattoos of skulls and daggers. He had a thick beard and eyes that looked like they were constantly scanning for a fight. The waitress, a young girl named Sarah, who had always been kind to Larry, looked terrified. She scurried between the tables, trying to keep the coffee flowing, but the Vipers were making it difficult. They made lewd comments, complained about the temperature of the food, and laughed loudly at their own cruel jokes. It was only a matter of time before their attention drifted from the menu to the other patrons. And there sat Larry, alone in the corner booth, trying to make himself invisible. It didn't work. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with a nose ring, nudged Bear and pointed. "Check out the zombie in the corner," he sneered, his voice carrying easily across the linoleum floor. "Someone tell him Halloween is in October." The laughter that followed was raucous and mean-spirited. Larry kept his eyes on his coffee, the steam rising and swirling in the air. He had learned long ago that reacting only fed the fire. He had endured interrogation training that would break most men. He could handle a few insults from a boy who had likely never faced anything more dangerous than a hangover. But the Vipers weren't content with just laughing from a distance. Emboldened by his silence, the wiry biker slid out of his booth and sauntered over to Larry's table. He slammed his hand down on the Formica, causing Larry's coffee to slosh over the rim. "I'm talking to you, freak show," the biker spat. "You deaf too, or just stupid?" Larry slowly lifted his head, his eyes, blue and piercing despite the sagging skin around them, locked onto the bikers. "I'm just trying to eat my pie, son," Larry said, his voice raspy like dry leaves on gravel. "Go back to your friends." The biker laughed, looking back at Bear for approval. "He speaks. I thought maybe our vocal cords were melted too." Bear stood up then, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he approached. He was an imposing figure, easily 6'4", with a presence that sucked the air out of the room. He didn't smile like the others. He looked at Larry with a mix of disgust and curiosity. "You got a problem with my boy here, Pops?" Bear asked, his voice a low rumble. "He's just asking a question. What happened to your face? You fall face first into a deep fryer?" The other bikers howled with laughter. Sarah, the waitress, stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Please, just leave him alone. He comes in here every week. He's a good customer." Bear didn't even look at her. He just waved a hand dismissively. "Shut it, sweetheart. The men are talking." He turned back to Larry, leaning in close, invading his personal space. The smell of stale beer and gasoline radiated off him. "You're ugly as sin, old man. You're putting me off my food. Maybe you should take that pie to go. Or better yet, go eat it in the alley where the rest of the trash is." Larry felt the old, familiar heat rising in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was the cold, focused rage he used to feel right before they blew a breach in the enemy defenses. But he was 76. His joints ached, and his hands weren't as steady as they used to be. He took a deep breath, calculating the distance to the door, realizing he couldn't make it past them. He decided to do the only thing he could to de-escalate. He would leave. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and placed it on the table. "Keep the change, Sarah," he muttered. He started to slide out of the booth, but the wiry biker blocked his path. "Where you going, zombie? We aren't done looking at you yet." The biker reached out and grabbed Larry's arm, his fingers digging into the sensitive, scarred tissue of Larry's forearm. Larry winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. That physical contact crossed a line. The pain was sharp, but the disrespect was agonizing. "Let go of me," Larry said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the rasp and gaining a steel edge. The wiry biker blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. "Or what? You gonna melt on me?" Bear chuckled, crossing his arms. "Let him go, Jimmy. Let's see what the old cripple does." Jimmy let go, shoving Larry slightly back into the booth. Larry stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the table. He felt dirty. He felt the grease of the biker's hand on his sleeve. He needed to wash it off. He needed to compose himself. Without a word, Larry turned and walked toward the small restroom at the back of the diner, his gait stiff but dignified. The bikers jeered as he walked away. "Yeah, run away, Scarface," Jimmy yelled. "Don't look in the mirror. You might scare yourself to death." The diner fell into an uncomfortable silence as the door clicked shut behind Larry. The other patrons looked down at their plates, ashamed of their own inaction, terrified of drawing the Viper's attention. Inside the restroom, Larry gripped the edges of the porcelain sink. He looked into the mirror. He saw the face that had scared children for 50 years. He saw the melted ear, the tight skin across his jaw. But beneath that, he saw the young man who had volunteered for the suicide squads of World War II. He turned on the faucet, the water running cold. He needed to wash his hands and forearms. The biker's touch felt like a contamination. Slowly, methodically, Larry unbuttoned the cuffs of his flannel shirt. He began to roll the sleeves up. The scarring on his hands was bad, the result of a fuel fire on the deck of a transport ship, but as he rolled the fabric past his wrists, past the burn lines, the skin smoothed out. And there, on the inside of his right forearm, preserved in faded green and black ink, was a tattoo. It wasn't the polished trident of the modern SEALs. It was the original insignia, a crude, defiant image of a frog standing on its hind legs, wearing a sailor's hat, chomping on a cigar, and holding a stick of dynamite. Larry scrubbed his hands, the soap foaming up his arms. He dried them with a rough paper towel, took a deep breath, and rolled his sleeves down only halfway, leaving the forearms exposed. He was done hiding. He pushed the door open and stepped back out into the diner. The Vipers were still laughing, high-fiving each other over their victory against the elderly man. Bear was facing the restroom, a smirk plastered on his face. "Oh, look, he's back. Did you cry it out, Pops?" Bear started to say, but the words died in his throat. His eyes dropped to Larry's exposed arms. He saw the scars, yes. But then his gaze locked onto the faded green ink on the right forearm. The smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of absolute confusion, then shock, and finally, a dawn of horrific realization. Bear was a veteran. He had served in the Gulf War. He knew military history. He knew what that frogman meant. Bear froze, his hand halfway to his beer bottle. The silence that radiated from him was so sudden and intense that the other bikers stopped laughing. "Boss?" Jimmy asked, confused. "What's wrong?" Bear didn't answer. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back with a screech. He walked toward Larry, but this time there was no swagger in his step. There was only a rigid military stiffness. Larry stopped, bracing himself for a punch. He clenched his fists, ready to go down swinging. Bear stopped 2 feet in front of him. He looked at the tattoo again, just to be sure. The cigar, the dynamite, the defiant stance of the frog. It was genuine. It was old ink, done with a single needle, probably on the deck of a ship in the South Pacific 70 years ago. "Is that?" Bear's voice was a whisper, trembling slightly. "Is that a UDT frog?" Larry looked at the large biker, confused by the question but answering honestly. "Class 12. Fort Pierce, 1944. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. UDT, Underwater Demolition Team, the Naked Warriors. These were the men who swam onto the beaches of Normandy, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima armed with nothing but a knife and explosives, days before the invasion, to blow up obstacles while the enemy fired directly down on them. They suffered casualty rates that made infantrymen shudder. They were the hardest of the hard, the grandfathers of special operations, and Bear had just spent the last 20 minutes mocking one of the few living legends left. Bear's face drained of color. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a deep, burning shame that seemed to shrink his massive frame. He looked at Larry's scars, the scars he had called ugly, and realized with a sickening thud in his gut that those weren't just burns. They were battle damage. They were the price paid for the freedom Bear enjoyed every day. Bear turned to his table, his eyes blazing with fury. "Stand up!" he barked at his men. The Vipers looked confused. "I said stand the hell up!" Bear roared. The 5 bikers scrambled to their feet, terrified by the shift in their leader. "Take off your hats," Bear commanded. Jimmy hesitated. "Bear, what the hell is—" "Take them off!" Bear screamed. They ripped their bandanas and caps off. Bear turned back to Larry. Tears were welling in the big biker's eyes. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the lump in his throat. I didn't know," Bear stammered, his voice breaking. "I was in the Navy, Gulf War. We learned about you guys. You're the reason we exist. You're the reason I made it home." Larry stood there, so stunned. The anger in his chest began to dissipate, replaced by a strange, quiet warmth. He hadn't heard anyone speak about the teams with reverence in decades. "It was a long time ago, son," Larry said softly. "We just did what we had to do." Bear shook his head violently. "No, you did what no one else could do?" Bear reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. He threw it on the counter near Sarah. "Pay for everyone in here," he announced, his voice booming to the entire diner. "Especially this man. His money is no good here. Not today. Not ever." He turned to Jimmy. the one who had grabbed Larry. "Apologize," Bear growled. "Apologize, or I leave you here on the side of the road." Jimmy, realizing he had made a colossal mistake, looked at the floor, his face burning red. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." Bear looked at Larry, standing at attention. Slowly, deliberately, the massive biker raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, sharp salute. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was a formal rendering of honors. "Sir," Bear said, holding the salute, "forgive us." One by one, the other bikers, realizing the gravity of the situation, straightened their posture. They didn't salute. They hadn't earned the right, but they bowed their heads in genuine deference. The diner was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Larry looked at Bear, seeing the regret in his eyes. He slowly raised his scarred, trembling hand and returned the salute. A bridge across generations, acknowledgement of a shared brotherhood that transcended time and appearance. "At ease, sailor," Larry whispered. Bear dropped his hand, wiped his eyes, and nodded. "We'll be going now, sir. We won't bother you again." The Vipers filed out of the diner, silent and humbled, leaving their food uneaten. Larry stood there for a moment, the silence of the room wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He walked back to his booth. Sarah was crying softly behind the counter. She brought a fresh pot of coffee and a new slice of pie on the house. "Thank you, Larry," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." Larry took a sip of the hot coffee. It tasted better than it had in years. He wasn't just the old burn victim in the corner anymore. He was Larry, the Frogman. He was seen. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man. This story reminds us that the scars people carry are often maps of their survival, not signs of their weakness. We live in a world that is quick to judge based on appearance, quick to dismiss the elderly, and quick to forget the sacrifices made by previous generations. Larry's scars were ugly to the ignorant eyes of the bikers, but they were badges of honor to those who knew the truth. Respect isn't about fear. It's about recognizing the value in others, especially those who have walked paths we can only imagine. If this story moved you, if you believe in honoring our veterans and treating everyone with dignity regardless of how they look, please subscribe to the channel. Share this video to spread the message that true heroes are all around us, often sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for us to just say, "Thank you."